back at WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively taking the Maryland Crab Cake Tour back out on the road. Delicious crab cakes. Might even be some oysters involved here in April. I'll be at Costas. We're also going to be doing it at Fadley's, and we're giving away these Maryland scratch-offs, the Instant Lottery throwback 50th anniversaries, and our friends, of course, at Window Nation, 866-90 Nation. You buy two, you get two free. 2 years, 0% financing. Keeping the bugs out this time of year. It's Lamar, and more Lamar, and opening day, and of course, March Madness and the Terps. And I always love having authors on when I get cool books and different stories where I don't have to talk about Lamar Jackson 24 hours a day. Kate Fagan has written a book. You know her from the Worldwide Leader and around the world. Hoop Muses, an insider's guide to pop culture and the women's game. Everybody writes books about the men's game. So when I had a chance to have Kate on for the first time, and her great headset, welcome in. How are you? I've seen you on my television from time to time. And every time I see Fagan, I was actually the Artful Dodger in Oliver in 1981. I have some grainy videotape of me singing "It's Wild," and I think Fagan was the lead character. So how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me and talking about this labor of love here. So I appreciate it.
You know what? Every time I have an author on, and I am one, I've written a couple of books. My two primaries were on the Ravens' first championship and the Ravens' second championship. So I understand the labor of love. And oh my God, I'm going to write a book, and I've got an index, and I got some stories, and I want to tell them. And even if you have a publisher and you're well compensated, the work of doing it, yours is, I can tell by the pictures in it that it's made for a whole bunch of different kind of people. But more than anything, when I think of the women's game and the history that's getting longer now, and especially with Maryland having great success here and them cut the nets down, that there's an entryway for every young lady, every young person, or even an old guy to say, hey, I want an entryway into the women's game. The history is part of like having fun with it. And I think putting something like this together where you are, this must have helped you go back into the Wayback Machine a little bit, huh?
Oh yeah, I went into the Wayback Machine. Speaking of entry points, we do have Christy Tolliver's game-winning shot in the 2006 NCAA title game. I'm sure your Maryland fans remember this moment when y'all beat Duke for that NCAA title. Is one of the 10 all-time greatest shots of all time in the book. But yeah, going into the Wayback Machine, I mean, I had played college hoops and been at ESPN, so I've been around the game my whole life, and I thought I knew the history of women's basketball, but once you dig into it, there's some really incredible stories from like 1896 to the 1904 to the 1930 stories that if they had happened on the men's side of the game, we would have had HBO scripted shows about them. They'd be famous stories, but of course they'd been buried by history. So it was really fun to go back in time and learn even more about a game that I love.
Well, all of those stories, there's a Hoosier somewhere in a gym in the 50s involving women. They just didn't make a movie about it, And listen, I went to high school in the 80s, and the women's game in and around, and I was a high school sports writer, prep writer at the Baltimore Sun back in the 80s. Breezy Bishop was here at Western, sending kids down to Pat Summit. A lot of these ladies, I'd say young ladies like Dana Johnson's not young, she's my age, but I mean, there was a pipeline out of Baltimore, not just for Muggsy Bogues and for Russ and for what John Thompson was doing at Georgetown, what Lefty was trying to do, make us the UCLA of the East. But the women's game is rich with that, and certainly fertile here, I think, in Baltimore and in Maryland, and in Connecticut and in Tennessee and at Louisiana Tech and at Old Dominion and all these places where there was a reputation and before Georgetown and Duke came along in the 80s.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, of course, we know about a lot of these modern stories, right? You're mentioning, I mean, somebody that I always had at camps when I was playing, Brenda Fries at Maryland, and all of those folks that you just named, like the Old Dominions. I mean, those were, for anybody who's casually paying attention to women's basketball, those are stories that you usually absorb. But like one that I hadn't even heard of was in 1925, Iowa, the powers that be in Iowa tried to cancel their girls' state basketball tournament. It was just there was a blowback happening about like team sports for women, and Iowa tried to cancel it. And this one man, John Ains, stood up and he was like, "Gentlemen, you are wrong, and you will be on the track when the train runs you over, because I know that people love this game." And so he saved girls basketball in Iowa and kept the state tournament going. And there'd be 7,000 people at this state tournament in the 1930s, like stuff you hadn't heard of, which directly ties to when I watch Caitlin Clark at Iowa, like the phenom playing at Iowa today. And the arena is sold out. I always kind of think back on the history of that moment almost 100 years ago that led to Iowa, even the state of Iowa, like you mentioned, Louisiana and Tennessee and Maryland and Yukon. Even the state of Iowa has rich stories that we've never heard.
Kate Fagan is our guest. The book is Hoop Muses. You can find it anywhere good books are sold. You can obviously find her out on the Twitter thing and with ALS. And I want to get to that before we disappear as well. Make sure we do a good turn here. But having you on, I'm thinking, I don't know enough about women's basketball to have Kate on, and like have a, and I don't know enough about men's basketball. I've been joking all week that I always lost my pool because I would refuse to take Duke on my pool. I'm a Maryland guy,
Yeah,
so like I'm
yeah.
not ever. So I always lost the damn pool. I never collected. So, but I was thinking about this just in the context of what we're talking about. You mentioned history. In the late 80s, I covered girls basketball, high school basketball, and I got to know Dave Greenberg over at Mount Hebron and my late great friend Bobby Nick at Wild Lake, and they were sending young ladies to Richmond to play, and they were getting into tournaments, and they were getting scholarships. And again, all these people are 45, 50 years old now, a little younger than I. But then I really thought about the history. There's a game here. IND and Mercy have been playing each other for 50. There was 25 years then. They used to play it at the Towson Center. Not hundreds, thousands, but not 10,000, but 2,500 people would come out to this game every year. And that was in the 80s. There were these rivalries that have existed in girls basketball. And to find stories that you don't know, I would think, when you say labor of love, what do you put out the beam to everybody and say, tell me the coolest story I don't know, and I'll put it in my book? Because that's kind of fun.
Yeah, I wish that was the way I'd done it, right? I'm not sure that any of my friends would have known some of these stories because you maybe could find one historian who cared about it and wrote something about it, but they just weren't widely disseminated. But like you said, like the storylines that have driven some of the modern understanding of the game, whether it's locally in Maryland or more of our national understanding, like the Pat Summitt versus Gino Auriemma kind of feuds, that stuff actually was also existing long, long ago in the history. I mean, it turns out that the first college basketball game on the West Coast, men or women, was played by Stanford and Cal. And this was 1896. So you're talking about like almost immediately after the game is invented, women are loving this game because it's not football. There's like there are rule structures in place that you can make it so that women are allowed to play. Because before then, all they were doing was calisthenics. You had some women playing tennis, but otherwise, basketball was the first game played in a gym with certain rules that you could have where you could limit physical interaction. And so women were loving this game actually on the West Coast, even before men were playing it intercollegiately. But it very quickly got shut down because it was seen as unseemly, and not something that women should be doing physically. There thought there would be bad ramifications. But that's all to say that a lot of the storylines and stakes that we love that have been grown over time on the men's side, we've got a shorter life that we know them on the women's side. But the effort in this book with like joy and vibrancy is to sort of reintroduce some of these stories and build back some of that mythology and history that has been lost on the women's side.
How do you know when you're done?
You don't. You just have a publication deadline, and you just got to send it off at some point.
It's done when they say it's done, right?
That's
Exactly.
right.
Kate Fagan is here. I hope everybody goes out and checks out the book. We haven't done a lot here on women's basketball. For you in taking this topic on and where you are, and you speak to sports in so many different ways. Give me the seed of the idea in taking this on and saying this is going to be a different kind of book, because it really is a different kind of book. It's not just a bio. And I think it was meant to be unique in that way.
It's supposed to be a work of art. It's supposed to be something you keep on your coffee table of all ages. It's not something you're supposed to read cover to cover. You're supposed to pick it up, maybe pop into a chapter or a graphic or an illustration and absorb it and then go about your day. And the seed of it was that, I had long loved women's sports, but I spent a lot of years at ESPN trying to like tell people to care, like at the end of Around the Horn, be like beating the drum for something. And you realize that doesn't work very well, is telling people to care about something. And so I decided instead to like pour my heart into this book to reflect the experience I had in women's sports and covering it. Like instead of being bitter and angry at its place in society, show the joy and love and vibrancy and humor and fun that exists in the game and the ways it collides with pop culture. And so I hope when people see this book, either they do right now or if they see it on a shelf, it's supposed to be joyful and fun and eye-popping. Because I think when you write a book about women's basketball history, most people will be like, oh, that's not for me. But this is supposed to be for everybody because people love good art and they love good ideas and they, comic book art and movie posters. And that's what this book is filled with in an attempt to get you to see the kind of beauty and love inside this game.
Anytime I have an author on, I always try to talk about people buying books and the importance of books. I was a sports writer at the newspaper in the 80s, the importance of newspapers and journalism and all the things that we do to hold power accountable and at the top level of journalism. But writing a book, I wrote the Ravens book in 2013. They won the championship. Joe Flacco, great story. I had inside access, big book. Tried to sell it to fans down in Ocean City, Maryland. At 10,000 people are there. They're all the basements are purple. Everybody's got purple beard, purple beards, purple everything. And they took a look at the book and they're like, that book ain't got no pictures. And I was like, woo! And then Trump got elected, and here we are. I worry for authors. I worry for every Barnes and Noble and for publishers. I know we've been like on the sides of caves. We were like, leaving things behind. But books as they are and the portability of them, I like a book, and I like physically holding this up as opposed to holding the PDF or whatever it is. But for you to write, you're a real author, and I know you want to write more of these things, and other people do too. It's important for people to read.
Yeah, well, and it's, selling a book, selling a book is hard. There's a few authors who just books sell, whether it's Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or, there's like a handful where
I
like
had Patterson and Lupica on a couple of weeks ago.
There you go. Like those things just fly off the shelves. But for the 99.9% of books underneath those big name authors, like it's a hustle. Just like you talking about Lamar Jackson at the outset, like sports fans can name 6 topics that we spend 99% of our time with in the media, whether it's LeBron James or, Lamar Jackson or whatever it is, where we beat that thing to death. And there's a lot of really rich, beautiful things underneath those sort of the star power stories. So this book is one where, like, if you pick it up and you happen to love it, like the only way that this book is going to spread is through word of mouth. And if you think it's beautiful and you think valuable, then you share that with friends or family members. I mean, that's the way books sell if they don't have that kind of high-end star power at the outset. And certainly one about the history of women's basketball, even if it's illustrated, is one of those where it's going to have to be like word of mouth for people to say they love it.
So if you want a book that's, I didn't know that about women's basketball, this will be the book. Hoop Muses. Kate Fagan is our guest. All right. Do you want to say anything about Lamar, or do you want to be Lamar free? I'm happy. I'm in Baltimore. I was Lamar'd out in November.
Yeah, no, I'm Lamar'd out, and frankly, I'm not sure I know the latest update. You don't need to tell me. I'm good without it. So I feel like I might flub it. I don't know what's been happening in the last couple of days.
We'll talk about it in the next segment, I'm sure.
All right. I'll stay tuned and I'll get updated.
Last thing for you, I saw your ALS advocacy, and I do a lot of things. My wife was diagnosed with leukemia 10 years ago, and I was Nasty Nestor doing sports radio. Last 10 years, we do a lot more serious issues. Obviously, our crab cake tour and the charity stuff that we try to do, but ALS is a thing I think 30, 40 years ago, I was like, oh, I remember the famous guy. Now everybody knows someone. And I think it's touched so many people, and I appreciate your advocacy and just want to give you a platform to talk about what you do as an ALS advocate.
Yeah, so my dad died of ALS a few years ago, and he had been a professional basketball player, and it tends to hit ex-military and athletes at a higher rate for reasons right now that remain a mystery to doctors and scientists. But it really, when you say like awareness about ALS, I do still think that's important, because I still think there's a study done by IMALS that showed that a majority of people, when you talk to them about ALS, they don't know some key details about it, like that it's 100% fatal. It's kind of lumped in with MS and other diseases, which of course we also need to talk about. But just understanding what ALS is and the devastation that it wreaks, I think is a really good starting point for people, because I think if you knew that this disease existed and you truly understood what it did, shutting down muscles, slowly all the way into, like your eyelids eventually. People would not want a world where that kind of devastating disease was a possibility. So I try to talk about it as much as I can, do work to raise money, because it's not an incurable disease. It's just an underfunded one in terms of finding some level of treatment, where there really still is no treatment that really does anything. It may slow slightly, but nothing that really impacts the progress of this disease. So it's just something that's close to my heart, because my dad taught me the game of basketball. So we certainly shared a bond.
Man, I drove into Boulder once. I never wanted to leave. I tell Chad Brown that every time I have
I
him on the
know.
show. Yeah, you don't want to leave Boulder when you go
No.
there. But how'd you wind up in Philadelphia covering? I mean, Boulder to Philly. I don't know. Listen, I appreciate you coming on. And for my heart with the ALS thing, OJ Brigance, someone who walked into my studio as a young man playing for the Baltimore Stallions in the 1990s, and then became a Ravens champion and became a Ravens employee. There's a whole chapter in Purple Rain 2 about him and the work that he does in the Brigance Brigade, which we have on all the time. So I'll start to get misty. It'll get,
Yeah.
the dust will be rolling in here. So I appreciate you. Good luck with the book. Please come back and visit again the next time you write, because we need more old
Yes.
sports writers to write books and stuff. Okay.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Kate Fagan joining us here. Follow her journey out on Twitter and out on the Worldwide Leader and everywhere they go. Hoop Muses is the book. You can find it anywhere good books are sold. You can find me out peddling Maryland Lottery free giveaways and the Instant Lottery Scratch Offs in the 50th anniversary, as well as our friend at Window Nation. We're going to be at Costas. We're going to be at Fadley's in early April. Don't forget, March Madness abounds. Play responsibly. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. All things Lamar coming up next. Stay with us. We're Baltimore Positive.